The Velori bombed Kepler-4 as a show of force, 400 kinetic warheads, enough to crack the crust of an abandoned human colony. But the bombs never hit. 2,000 meters above the surface, every single one of them simply stopped, a frozen chandelier of destruction hanging in the void. Then, impossibly, they began to drift back upward. Something down there was still awake, and it had just politely declined the war. The Velori Combine had meant their strike as a declaration of dominance. Instead, they found themselves staring at a physics-defying rebuttal. Kepler-4 was never the ghost town Earth told the galaxy it was. 11 years earlier, when the official evacuation was announced, humanity had quietly converted the entire planet into a gravitic weapons test bed. A planetary-scale defense array with a skeleton crew of 9 engineers who spent a decade hoping they'd never have to switch it on. Now, with 400 warheads hanging frozen above its surface, the array was fully active, and its chief engineer was about to send a reply that would redefine deterrence forever. Margaret Osa had stopped counting the days in year 3. 11 years earlier, she'd been a mid-level structural physicist when the UN's Black Budget Division pulled her from obscurity and handed her a classified file stamped with a single word: pitfall. The file detailed something the public never saw, a stellar instability scare in the Kepler system that might have threatened the colony world Kepler-4. Except the instability was never real. It was a cover story, fabricated at the highest levels to justify an emergency evacuation of 2 million colonists. The real reason for emptying the planet was far more audacious. Earth needed a gravity well large enough to test a radical new defense system, one that could manipulate gravitational fields at planetary scale. They called it the Orbital Ring Array, and they built it in absolute secrecy, hidden behind the fiction of an empty world. The array was not a weapon in any conventional sense. It didn't fire missiles or lasers. Instead, it generated precisely shaped gravity envelopes capable of catching, redirecting, or holding any mass that entered its sphere of influence. The engineering demands were staggering. 30,000 kilometers of superconducting rings woven through a dozen station modules, powered by geothermal taps drilled into the planet's molten core, all coordinated by an artificial intelligence named Dirac. Construction took 4 years, consuming a budget that rivaled the gross domestic product of several Earth nations combined. When it was finally completed, the UN handed the keys to Osai and a hand-picked crew of 8 others, technicians, physicists, a medic, a cook, and one very bored intelligence officer whose main job was to make sure nobody outside the program ever learned the truth. They became the last 9 humans on Kepler-4, custodians of the most powerful defensive system ever built. The mission parameters were simple: maintain readiness, run quarterly tests, and never, ever make contact with external civilization. For 11 years, they did exactly that. Osai grew tomatoes in a hydroponics bay and listened to old jazz recordings while the array hummed in standby mode. Her log entries became shorter each year, the monotony broken only by routine drills and the occasional maintenance spacewalk. She'd often think about the absurdity of their situation: 9 people alone on a world that the galaxy believed was a dead husk, babysitting technology that could rewrite the physics of a small war. And yet, she hoped it would stay that way forever. Not because she feared combat, but because she understood what the array represented: a capability so overwhelming that using it even once would change humanity's place in the galaxy irrevocably. That hope ended on a Tuesday morning when Dirac's calm voice announced a high-velocity swarm on approach. The Velori Combine, a militaristic species from the inner spiral arm, had been escalating tensions with human frontier settlements for months. They'd filed territorial complaints, staged border provocations, and finally decided to make an example of what they believed was an abandoned human world. A message to Earth that the Combine would not be ignored. 400 kinetic warheads, launched from a cruiser stationed outside the heliopause, accelerated to a fraction of light speed, each carrying enough destructive force to punch through continental plates. It was an overkill strike designed for spectacle. Osai watched the tracking plot fill with incoming trajectories. She had practiced this scenario hundreds of times in simulation, but the simulation never prepared her for the weight of actual responsibility. The crew scrambled to their stations, and the array woke from its decade-long slumber. Gravitic generators spooled up, their subsonic hum spreading through the rock beneath their feet. Os gave the order to engage the catch-and-hold protocol. The array reached out with invisible fingers, forming a containment grid at 2,000 meters above the surface. The warheads slammed into the gravity envelope and stopped dead, their momentum absorbed by the planetary mass itself. They hung there, 400 points of light, perfectly suspended in a geometric lattice that stretched across the sky. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then came the question from her second-in-command. What do we do with them? Osai stared at the frozen warheads on her display. She could detonate them harmlessly in the upper atmosphere. She could shunt them into a decaying orbit and let friction destroy them. But that would simply leave the Velori wondering what had happened. They'd likely try again, perhaps with different tactics. Osai realized that their secret was now partially exposed. The array had been activated, and the Velori would certainly probe further. The only way to prevent escalation was to send a message so precise, so psychologically calibrated, that it would eliminate any appetite for future attack. She typed the coordinates herself: Velori Test Range Moon 7, an uninhabited rock used for weapons development. It had been listed in intelligence reports as a site with zero sapient presence, just automated monitoring gear. Then she instructed Durack to calculate a return trajectory for all 400 projectiles, preserving their exact launch grid configuration, and append a single line of text to the data packet that would accompany them. The text read, "Your property, delivered. Kepler Station." At 0913 station time, the array released its grip and gently accelerated the warheads back along their inbound path, redirected toward the moon. The Velori cruiser's sensors would see them leaving the planet, now traveling away at impossible speed, as if the world itself had bounced them back like stones off a mirror. The warheads entered jump space a few moments later, vanishing from local detection. On the Velori command deck, Tactical Officer Calves watched the track inversion with growing horror. He had no doctrinal response for this. The bombs were now traveling toward Velori-held space, and the only accompanying signal was a short text file that his translation subprocessor rendered into Velori script. He read it 3 times before his vocal folds could produce sound. The message was not a threat, not a declaration of war. It was a receipt. Somewhere in the Combine, on a dead moon that had never known bloodshed, 400 warheads were about to land with the same precision they'd been launched. And the Velori High Command was going to have to explain how a nation that had poured centuries into military expansion had just been effortlessly disarmed and returned to sender by a planet with 9 people on it. The warheads materialized above Test Range Moon 7 exactly 97 minutes after they had been halted above Kepler 4. They arrived in the same flawless grid, descending at precisely the angle of their original launch, reversed as if time itself had been folded. The Velori monitoring station recorded everything: 400 impact signatures, not one deviating from its assigned coordinate by more than a meter. The automated systems flagged it as a calibration error 3 times before the station's lone technician overrode the filters and stared at the impossible truth. By the time he finished drafting his report, The Velori High Command had already received a brief, unencrypted transmission from an unknown human source. A single image of the warheads froze in midair above a gray planet, with 4 words overlaid. Your property. Delivered. Kepler Station. Admiral Korvax of the Velori War Council watched the image loop on his tactical display for nearly an hour. His jaw ridges, normally rigid with command confidence, twitched with something his subordinates rarely saw: uncertainty. The Velori Combine had spent 3 centuries building the most fearsome military apparatus in the inner spiral arm. Their fleet numbered 6,000 combat vessels. Their weapon labs churned out new annihilation tech every fiscal cycle, and their strategic doctrine rested on a simple premise: that overwhelming force, visibly applied, guaranteed compliance. A single dead world was supposed to have been an unremarkable footnote in that doctrine. Instead, the footnote had swallowed the entire theory and returned it as a receipt. Korvax summoned his chief science officer, a thin-plated xenophysicist named Erdeth, and demanded an explanation. The array's existence had been hidden so deeply that even the Velori's most aggressive intelligence gathering had never detected it. Erdeth ran the telemetry 37 times before delivering his conclusion. Whatever human technology had stopped the warheads was not a point defense laser or a shield. It was a gravitic manipulation field operating at planetary scale, capable of absorbing multiple relativistic impacts simultaneously and redirecting them with sub-centimeter precision. No species in known space possessed anything approaching that capability. The power requirements alone suggested a civilization that had moved beyond brute force energy generation into something resembling controlled spacetime curvature, and it had been sitting on Kepler-4, fully operational, for over a decade, with the galaxy none the wiser. The War Council erupted. Some demanded immediate retaliatory escalation, a full fleet deployment, scorched earth protocols, biological agents that could bypass kinetic defenses. Others, quieter, asked the question that Korvax had been silently turning over since the image arrived. If the humans could have annihilated the Velori cruiser and its 40,000 crew, why didn't they? The message said delivered, not defeated. No threats, no demands, no gloating. Just the act itself, a mirror held up to the Combine's aggression with terrifying calm. The implication was worse than any ultimatum. Humanity had known exactly what the Velori were trying to do, could have ended them, and chose not to. That was not mercy. That was a demonstration of absolute confidence. On Earth, the first sign that something had gone cosmically sideways arrived in a secure briefing room beneath Geneva. Director Ilara Vance of the United Nations Special Projects Division had been reading agricultural reports when the Durac AI transmitted a priority alert through channels that had been silent since the Pitfall program was sealed. She read OSI's concise after-action summary: 402 hostile kinetic projectiles intercepted, captured, and returned to sender coordinates. No casualties. Array status nominal. And felt the floor drop out of her stomach. 11 years of secrecy, 11 years of hoping the array would never need to be used, undone in a single morning. Vance convened an emergency session of the Oversight Committee, a body so classified that its members did not appear on any government payroll. The room filled with the faces of military strategists, intelligence chiefs, and the handful of political leaders who had kept the Kepler project alive across 3 administrations. The debate was immediate and fierce. Some argued for full disclosure, positioning humanity as a responsible power that had defensive capabilities and used them with restraint. Others warned that revealing the array would trigger an arms race across every major species, destabilizing the fragile diplomatic balance that had held for 2 centuries. The Velori, they pointed out, might interpret restraint as weakness and strike again. But Vance saw a third path, one that OS had already, perhaps accidentally, set in motion. Don't announce the array. Don't deny it. Let the Velori's own intelligence apparatus do the work. Let them wonder. Let the uncertainty become its own deterrent. The Velori did exactly that. Within 48 hours, their intelligence directorate had reconstructed a timeline from scraps of intercepted communications, gravitational anomaly data, and old personnel manifests from the Kepler colony. The evacuation of Kepler-4 in 3070 had been a fiction. The colonists had been resettled not because of stellar instability, but because Earth needed an uninhabited gravity well for the array's construction. Human engineers had hollowed out entire mountain ranges to house gravitic generators, bored kilometer-deep shafts for geothermal taps, and assembled the largest single construction project in human history, all while the rest of the galaxy believed the planet was a radioactive wasteland. The longer the Velori analysts dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Humanity hadn't hidden the array to launch a surprise attack. They'd hidden it because they genuinely didn't want to use it. This realization fractured the Velori command. A faction led by Admiral Korvax argued that the Combine had been handed a strategic gift, proof that humans were more interested in defense than offense, which meant the Velori could negotiate from a position of moral superiority, casting Earth as a deceptive power that had violated interstellar transparency accords. Another faction, younger officers who had grown up on stories of Combine invincibility, saw the Kepler incident as a humiliation that demanded blood repayment. Korvax suppressed them, but barely. He authorized a covert reconnaissance mission to Kepler-4, a stealth probe designed to map the array's capabilities and, if possible, find a vulnerability. Durack detected the probe within seconds of its arrival. Osai, still running on adrenaline and caffeine, watched it drift through the outer marker buoys with the quiet curiosity of a biologist spotting a new insect. She could crush it instantly. She could let it wander and learn nothing. She chose a third option. Durack gently nudged the probe into a stable orbit around the array's least sensitive module, then transmitted a real-time feed of the station's interior. Her crew eating breakfast, a chess game on a mess hall table, a pot of tomatoes ripening under grow lights. No weapons, no soldiers, just 9 tired engineers trying to live normal lives on the galaxy's most dangerous piece of real estate. The probe's data stream, unbeknownst to its Velori operators, now included a single appended line in flawless Velori script. "We're still hopping, you'll let us go back to being boring." When the probe's feed reached the Velori High Command, the room went silent. The young officers who had demanded blood suddenly had no target worth hitting. The array wasn't a fortress of warriors itching for a fight. It was a maintenance crew with a garden. And yet that maintenance crew had stopped 400 warheads and sent them back like misdelivered mail. The contrast was so jarring, so fundamentally alien to the Velori warrior ethos, that it sparked a psychological crisis within the War Council. How do you intimidate people who don't seem intimidated by themselves? How do you threaten someone who can kill you and still chooses to show you their tomatoes? On Earth, the covert intelligence leaks began almost simultaneously. Someone in the Oversight Committee, probably from a member state that had always opposed the Pitfall program's secrecy, fed sanitized details to 3 major news networks. Within a day, the phrase Kepler array was trending across every human-settled world. Public reaction split along predictable lines. Some celebrated the technological achievement and the moral victory. Others condemned the secrecy and demanded the array be dismantled before it provoked retaliation. Protest movements erupted in 12 capital cities. A whistleblower from the Pitfall Logistics Corps released construction cost figures, an amount so staggeringly high that it made the combined budgets of every human space agency look like pocket change. The revelation that all of this had been hidden behind a fake stellar emergency cost the current UN administration its parliamentary majority within a week. And yet, the most significant consequence was not political but existential. For the first time in human history, the species possessed a defensive capability that rendered conventional aggression functionally obsolete, and it had been built in secret by a democratic government that had deliberately chosen to hide it from its own people. The ethical question was no longer whether humanity had the right to defend itself. The question was whether humanity could trust itself with a power that made war impossible for anyone except the people who held the off switch. Because the array could do more than catch bombs. It could, in theory, catch fleets, moons, anything inside its gravitational envelope. And the only thing standing between that power and catastrophe was the judgment of a woman who had spent 11 years growing vegetables, and hopping her phone never rang. But her phone had not stopped ringing for 72 hours. Osa had stopped answering it entirely, delegating external communication to Durak's automated protocols while she focused on the rapidly evolving tactical picture. The Velori probe still orbited peacefully, broadcasting her tomato garden to a bewildered enemy command. She had hoped that the absurdity of the gesture, a hydroponic peace offering, would buy time for cooler heads to prevail. Instead, it had enraged a faction she didn't yet know existed. Commander Thalix of the Velori Expeditionary Strike Corps watched the probe feed with a fury that bordered on religious offense. He was a younger officer, scarred by ritual combat and shaped by a doctrine that equated mercy with contamination. To him, the human's restraint was not magnanimity. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate mockery of Velori warrior identity. When Korvax ordered a stand-down and began drafting preliminary contact protocols, Thalix saw weakness. He appealed quietly to the Council of Claws, a shadowy cadre of traditionalist elders who held sway over the Combine's most zealous military wings. Within a day, he had authorization for a black operation, deliberately hidden from Korvax's chain of command. The objective was no longer intimidation. It was seizure. Thalix assembled a strike force of 300 elite Void warriors and loaded them into a swarm of resonance-shielded boarding pods. The pods were designed to ride the gravitational bounce of a planetary mass, masking their approach signatures by mimicking natural micrometeoroid swarms, thousands of tiny echoes that would overwhelm any conventional tracking system. The array's gravity envelope was formidable, but the Velori tacticians had studied the telemetry. They believed that if they scattered the pods across a wide enough approach cone, some would inevitably penetrate the envelope's fringes where the field was weakest. And once a single pod breached the ring modules, a squad of Void warriors could tear through unarmored engineers like wet paper. Durak identified the anomaly 13 minutes before contact. The initial sensor return showed nothing but a diffuse debris cloud, unremarkable, statistically common, the kind of clutter that the array's filters typically ignored. But Durak had been learning. The AI cross-referenced the cloud's expansion pattern against known debris profiles from the original warhead strike and found a discrepancy. The fragments were too uniform, their velocities too coordinated, their trajectories too eccentric. I felt the cold spike of recognition. It was a swarm designed to look like random junk, and it was decelerating. She ordered Durak to initiate a high-resolution gravitic sweep. The resonance shielding was good, but not perfect. At maximum amplification, the array's sensors resolved the individual pods, 312 objects, each carrying a single Velori soldier in a crash couch, surrounded by hardened breaching tools and personal weaponry. They were not missiles, they were a boarding party. The tactical implications hit Osai like a physical blow. The array could stop them, but the method mattered. A full-field gravitic spike would crush the pods instantly, killing everyone inside. A targeted shunt like she'd used on the warheads, might fracture the pod's shielding and expose the occupants to tidal forces that would turn their organs to jelly. The array had been designed to repel inanimate weapons. It had never been tested on living beings. Her second-in-command, a wiry systems engineer named Park, ran the calculations in real time. If they did nothing, the first pods would reach the outer ring in 11 minutes. If they fired the gravitic pulse, they'd be committing mass killing. The crew's medic, a former trauma surgeon named Destat, put it bluntly. They came here to kill us, Margaret. You don't owe them a clean conscience. But Os couldn't separate the tactical from the strategic. Killing 300 Velori soldiers on top of the warhead return would escalate from restrained message to declared war. It would vindicate every hardliner in the Combine who wanted to paint humanity as a lurking monster. The peace she had tried to buy with those frozen bombs would evaporate. And yet, letting them board meant losing the station, and potentially handing the most powerful weapon ever built to a species that would certainly use it. Then Durack proposed an option that existed nowhere in the tactical manuals. The array's containment grid wasn't limited to large masses. If modulated to microgravitic resolution, it could theoretically isolate each boarding pod and steer it into a different docking bay, all simultaneously, using the station's own emergency cargo ports. The catch was precision. The pods were traveling at hypersonic speeds, and the margins for error were vanishingly small. A single misfire would splatter a pod against the ring structure, and even if it worked, they'd have 300 armed invaders inside the station, scattered across dozens of compartments. Park argued that it was suicide. Osa countered. Not if they sealed each compartment and vented atmosphere selectively, forcing the soldiers to drop weapons or suffocate. They could be routed into pre-prepared holding areas, repurposed storage bays with thick blast doors, remote lockdown, and independent life support. It was insane, but it was possible. Os gave the order. The next 9 minutes were the longest of her life. Durack engaged the microgrid, and the array's gravitic generators spooled to a pitch that made the station's structural ribs vibrate like tuning forks. The first wave of pods hit the envelope and were snatched from their trajectories with the delicacy of a raptor catching sparrows. One by one, they were redirected, not stopped cold like the warheads, but gently decelerated along curved paths into a dozen docking bays that Osai had designated. The AI managed the ballet with machine precision, but human error crept in at the edges. 3 pods clipped the edge of their approach vectors and spun violently, their occupants blacking out from G-forces. 2 more overshot their bays and had to be looped around for a second pass. Through it all, Osai monitored the telemetry with clenched fists, refusing to breathe until the last pod thumped into Bay 17 and Durack confirmed. All 312 targets contained. No catastrophic structural breaches. No atmospheric leaks in the living quarters. The station was still hers, but the crisis was far from over. The captured soldiers, disoriented and enraged, began breaching their pod hatches almost immediately. Osai had already initiated the compartment lockdown sequence. Blast doors slammed down, isolating each bay and the connecting corridors. Destat, monitoring the internal cameras, noted a grim detail. The Velori Void warriors were not wearing environment suits. They had been prepared for combat, not vacuum. That meant they needed air. And air was something Osai controlled absolutely. She opened a channel to every compartment speaker and addressed the invaders in their own language, a phrase she had Durack translate from the probe's intercepted communications. Lay down your weapons and you will breathe. Keep them, and you will not. The feed she transmitted to the Velori High Command, routed through the same probe she'd once used to show her tomatoes, was even more devastating than the warhead grid. It showed corridor after corridor of Velori elite soldiers sitting on the floor, their breaching tools stacked in neat piles, their wrist blades magnetically locked to wall panels. Above them, a single overhead light panel had been reprogrammed to display the Kepler station insignia, a stylized human hand holding an olive branch, surrounded by orbital rings. The message appended to the transmission was shorter than the last. All personnel safe. Please arrange pickup. We'll provide snacks. Admiral Korvax received this data with the dawning horror of a commander who had just lost control of his own military. The Black Ops unit he had not authorized, launched in defiance of his direct orders, had been not only thwarted but turned into a propaganda defeat of catastrophic proportions. The footage was already spreading through the Velori information networks. The Council of Claws could not suppress it because Korvax himself now weaponized it, publicly denouncing Thalix as a rogue actor and demanding his immediate arrest. The political earthquake that followed shattered a century of military hierarchy. Korvax used the humiliation to consolidate power, purging the hardliner factions and extending an unprecedented formal request for diplomatic contact with Earth. For the first time in Velori history, a warrior species was asking not for surrender, but for forgiveness. On Earth, the fallout was accelerating. The second attack on Kepler-4 had been detected by multiple external observatories, and the Oversight Committee could no longer pretend that Pitfall was a passive program. Whistleblowers who had already leaked the array's existence now provided a detailed timeline of the boarding attempt, including OSI's radio transmissions. The phrase, "we'll provide snacks," became a viral slogan overnight, splashed across protest signs and editorial cartoons. OSI's face, captured from an old university ID photo, began appearing on news broadcasts. The gardener who stopped an invasion with a lunch offer and gravity tricks. The reluctant soldier who still hadn't fired a shot, but the fame was a double-edged blade. Security analysts pointed out that the array's very existence invited escalation. If one species could build a planetary shield, others would find ways to circumvent it. The Velori's resonance-shielded pods were just the first attempt. What came next? Genetically engineered pathogens that gravity couldn't catch. Sublight-speed debris clouds too diffuse to halt. An all-out assault by a coalition of terrified neighbors who saw Earth's silence as prelude to empire. The ethical calculus shifted. OSI's restraint, admirable in isolation, might be perceived as vulnerability by actors less principled than Korvax. The Oversight Committee split into three warring factions: those who wanted to publicize the array and use it as a diplomatic lever, those who wanted to dismantle it immediately under treaty supervision, and those who wanted OSI removed and replaced with a military commander willing to use lethal force without hesitation. In the midst of this maelstrom, a formal summons arrived for Margaret OSI. The UN Security Council, in closed session, requested her testimony via secure quantum relay. They wanted to hear, directly from her, why she had chosen not to kill twice, and what she thought Earth should do next. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The Velori had already agreed to send Korvax himself as an observer, a silent witness to the human decision-making process that would determine the fate of their species, relationship. The galaxy, watching through a dozen clandestine feeds, held its breath. The woman who had grown tomatoes while holding the galaxy's most dangerous secret was about to explain herself to a planet that had never known she existed. The UN Security Council hearing was convened in absolute secrecy, the chamber sealed and swept for surveillance. Margaret Ose appeared not in person, but as a flickering hologram projected from the Kepler command deck, the array's ring light casting faint cyan halos across her tired face. She had not slept in 4 days. The council delegates were arrayed in their formal ranks, a semicircle of grim faces and whispered consultations. At one side, separated by a transparent partition, sat Admiral Korvax of the Velori Combine, his great-scaled head lowered in an attitude of solemn attention. The formal charges were read into the record: unauthorized use of classified technology, potential violation of interstellar weapons conventions, dereliction of diplomatic protocol. The list was long and designed to intimidate. Osai waited until the reading finished, then spoke in a voice so calm it unnerved the entire chamber. "I understand," she said, "that you believe the array was built to defend against an alien attack. That was the cover story. It was necessary, but it was never the truth. The Pitfall program existed for one reason, and that reason was not war." She paused, and the room held its breath. The star around which Kepler-4 orbits was dying. The stellar instability we used as an excuse to evacuate the colony was real. It was not a fabrication. When our Deep Space Observatory first detected the anomalous magnetic fluctuations in the star's core, our best models predicted a catastrophic eruption within 40 years. A Nova-class event that would have destroyed the entire Kepler system, sterilized every habitable world within a 20-light-year radius, and bathed the inner spiral arm in lethal radiation for a century. The Velori homeworld included, and yours, delegates, Earth itself. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over each other, demanding confirmation, accusing Osai of manufacturing a crisis to justify the array's construction. But she pressed on, her voice cutting through the noise. 9 years before the evacuation, the UN authorized Project Pitfall as a stellar intervention mission. The array was never a weapons testbed. It was a gravitic stabilizer, designed to dampen the core oscillations of a dying star. Every piece of the system, the geothermal taps, the superconducting rings, Dirac itself, was engineered to generate precisely tuned gravity waves that counteract the instabilities driving the star toward detonation. The planet was converted into a control platform because we needed a fixed anchor deep within the star's gravity well. The technology was ludicrously powerful, yes. It could, in theory, stop relativistic warheads, but that was a side effect, not the purpose. Admiral Korvax rose from his seat, his translator stammering as he processed the revelation. "You are telling us," he rumbled, "that the weapon we tried to destroy was the only thing preventing our own extinction." Osai met his gaze without flinching. "The array has been keeping your son and mine alive for 11 years. When your warheads came in, we could not allow them to strike the surface because a single deep-crust impact might have disrupted the gravitic emitters buried there. The star would have destabilized within hours. My crew and I had no margin for error. That is why I returned your bombs to an uninhabited testing moon and prayed you would read the gesture correctly. I was not demonstrating human superiority. I was trying to keep us all alive." The implications rippled outward with the force of a gravity wave. The Velori military had nearly caused an extinction-level event not just for humanity but for their own species, and they had done so while pursuing a pointless display of force. The Council of Claws, already reeling from Korvax's purge, now faced the abyss of their own catastrophic miscalculation. Within hours of the testimony, the remaining hardliner factions collapsed. Korvax, his authority now absolute but his expression haunted, issued a formal statement of contrition on behalf of the Combine, acknowledging that the Velori people owed their continued existence to the very humans they had attacked. The gesture was unprecedented in Velori history, a warrior species admitting they had been shielded from self-destruction by a race they had dismissed as deceptive and weak. On Earth, the disclosure triggered a seismic shift in public consciousness. The protests that had demanded the array's dismantling were replaced overnight by solemn vigils and a groundswell of support for the Pitfall crew. The leaked construction costs, once a scandal, were recalculated as the price of saving an entire sector of the galaxy. The whistleblowers who had exposed the program pivoted from condemnation to advocacy, arguing that the secrecy had been a tragic necessity, because any premature disclosure would have invited the very militarization the array's true mission was designed to prevent. The fallen UN administration was replaced by an emergency coalition government that immediately moved to ratify the Kepler Accords, a new interstellar agreement that classified stellar stabilization technology as a shared galactic commons, to be administered not by any single nation, but by a joint interspecies council. Margaret Osai was nominated as the first director of the newly formed Interstellar Stability Authority, a role she initially refused. She wanted to go back to her tomatoes, she said, to the quiet rhythm of maintenance logs and the familiar hum of the array. But the array had fundamentally changed. With the Velori crisis resolved and the star's oscillations fully damped, the system was transitioning from emergency intervention to routine monitoring. Its defensive capabilities, however, remained intact. And the galaxy was now fully aware that humanity possessed the means to catch relativistic warheads, redirect them, and if necessary, do far more. The question of what to do with that power remained as urgent as ever. Korvax himself traveled to Kepler-4, the first Velori to set foot on the planet his species had tried to destroy. He met Osai in the same docking bay that had held 300 of his captured soldiers. The compost bins from her hydroponics garden still sat against one wall, leafy greens spilling over their edges. He offered a formal apology, not as a warrior to an engineer, but as one thinking being to another. Os accepted it with the same quiet grace she had shown when the warheads hung frozen above her head. "The array taught me something," she told him. "Power isn't measured by what you can destroy. It's measured by what you can protect without ever having to fire a weapon. I've spent 11 years doing that. I'd like to spend a few more." The agreement they drafted together formed the basis of the Kepler Accords. It committed both species, and eventually dozens of others, to a mutual defense network anchored by the array's successor platforms, which would be built around other unstable stars across the galaxy. But the heart of the Accords was a single clause, inserted at Osai's insistence. No member species could deploy gravitic array technology for offensive purposes. The capability to annihilate fleets and crack worlds would be held in trust solely for stellar preservation and planetary defense. Violation of that clause would trigger a collective response from every signatory, including the full weight of the array's original configuration. But the point, Osai emphasized, was that no one wanted to see that configuration ever activated again. The final ratification ceremony was held on Earth, in the rebuilt General Assembly Hall. Osai stood at the podium in a simple blue jumpsuit, her face still lined with exhaustion but her eyes bright. She held up a single tomato grown from seeds she had carried from Kepler-4. "This," she said, "is what we were really doing out there, learning how to sustain life, not end it. The array was just a very complicated trellis." The delegates, human and alien alike, rose to their feet. The applause lasted for 6 minutes. Korvax, seated in the Velori delegation's box, did not rise. He wept. His species had spent 3 centuries building a culture around the certainty that strength demanded violence. And in the span of a few months, a human engineer with a garden had shown that the opposite was true. That the most devastating power is the power you choose never to use. That the strongest grip is the one that could crush but instead cradles. And that the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy had been built not to kill, but to save. Years later, historians would debate whether the revelation of the array's true purpose had been inevitable. Some argued that the cover story had almost triggered the very war it was designed to prevent. Others maintained that the secrecy was the only way to buy the time needed to stabilize the star without interference. Osai never engaged in those debates. She retired to a small research station on one of Earth's orbital habitats, where she continued to cultivate tomatoes and submitted occasional papers on gravitic agriculture. When asked about her legacy, she would smile and say that she was just a gardener who happened to have a very large hoe. But the galaxy remembered. The image of 400 warheads suspended above a dead gray world, caught in mid-fall by invisible hands, became the defining icon of a new era, not an era of human dominance, but an era in which humanity had earned its place at the table not by conquering, but by demonstrating that the highest form of power is the quiet, unyielding insistence that everyone deserves to keep breathing. The story of Kepler-4 is fiction, but it rests on a question that is entirely real. What does true strength look like? For most of human history, the answer was obvious: the ability to strike harder, move faster, and destroy more completely than anyone else. Every empire that rose did so on the back of that assumption. The Valori believed it. Every Cold War strategist on Earth understood the logic of mutual assured destruction. The doctrine was simple: if you can guarantee that attacking me means your own annihilation, you will never attack. It worked more or less for decades, but it always carried an unspoken cost. The moment you built that kind of power, you became a threat just by existing. Your silence looked like plotting. Your restraint looked like weakness waiting to pounce. The cycle fed itself. What Kepler-4 imagined was something different. Not a weapon, but a shield so effective that it could catch every spear thrown at it and set them gently down. Not a fist, but an open hand. And behind that hand, not a general itching for a fight, but a woman growing tomatoes. Hopping the galaxy would simply leave her alone. The story's most radical idea is not that humanity built a gravitic array capable of bending space. It is that after 11 years of absolute, unchallengeable power, no one had ever used it to threaten anyone. The array's deadliest capability was not its ability to catch bombs. It was the fact that its creators, despite every temptation, every provocation, and every reasonable fear, chose to bury it under a garden. That moral restraint is the hardest thing to believe in any story about power. History is littered with examples of nations that swore their terrifying new weapons would never be used, only to find reasons to use them anyway. The nuclear bomb was built to end a war, and it did. But the decades that followed were spent building more, and more, and more, enough to erase civilization many times over. And the only thing keeping them in their silos has been a fragile web of treaties, inspections, and the desperate hope that no one blinks. The idea that a species might get it right on the first try, build the ultimate shield, and genuinely, consistently, choose not to weaponize it is almost science fiction. But it is the kind of science fiction worth telling. Because the question the array poses is not just for aliens or future humans. It is for us, right now, standing in a world where new technologies arrive faster than our ethics can catch them. What do we do with the power that makes war too costly to start? Do we flaunt it? Do we hide it? Or do we quietly keep it ready, hopping we never need it while watering our gardens and keeping the lights on? Margaret Osai's answer was as simple as it was profound. We protect. That is all. We protect each other, even those who do not yet know they need protecting. And we do not ask for applause. If you found this story worth your time, there are more waiting. Subscribe and tap the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Until then, keep watching the skis and maybe plant something while you wait.